In 3, 2, 1.
Hey everyone, it's Brendan from the Topeka Zoo and Conservation Center, and welcome to our 10 o'clock virtual education program. Before we turn it over to Rachel, I want to give a quick shout out and highlight a local small business. And today we're talking about Blind Tiger Brewery and Restaurant. I was able to speak to Jay Ives, the president of Blind Tiger, this morning and get some updates. And they are still open, but Jay explained that they are actually down about 70%. So if you're looking for a place to eat, to order, or do curbside pickup, consider giving Blind Tiger a little bit of business. My favorite burger there is the Kansan burger, and it's got local connections and even connections to this zoo. The Kansan burger is a bison burger grown right here in Shawnee County, and every part of the bison is used, including bones from harvested bison, come back and are fed to animals here at the zoo, including our tigers. So it's a really great sustainable story that involves Topeka and Shawnee County and connects right to our zoo here. So now we're going to turn it over to Rachel, who's talking fourth grade today.
Alrighty, thank you so much, Brendan, and thank you to our sponsors of our virtual education program, Topeka Collegiate and the Kokari Foundation. We graciously appreciate your sponsorship of this class. Now today, friends, we are going to talk about fourth grade curriculum relating to structures in amphibians, one of the neatest animal groups in the animal kingdom. Now, if you remember last week, we focused on reptiles and what that means. Well, today, amphibians is the next animal group because oftentimes reptiles and amphibians, they get confused from people. So I want to talk about what it means to be an amphibian and compare and contrast it to what it means to be a reptile. So if you see something out in the wild, you can know if it's an amphibian or if it is a reptile. And again, as always, we'll talk about the internal and external structures that make up amphibians. So amphibians are animals that have the smooth, wet skin. And when I say amphibians, I'm talking about a few different animals. Normally, people know that frogs are amphibians, as are toads. All frogs and toads in the world represent this animal group. There are over 8,000 amphibian species in the world, 90% of which are frogs. So most of them are going to be frogs. Now frogs, the largest frog in the world is the Goliath frog. These live over in Africa. They can get up to 12.5 feet long and weigh up to 7 pounds, which is gigantic if you think about it. Here you can see a man holding a frog and it's bigger than his hand. These things are really, really big. Now, frogs and toads are oftentimes confused, so I want to talk a little bit about the difference. Frogs, they have long legs for jumping. They have moist, smooth skin. They have teeth in the upper part of their jaw. Their eyes bulge out and they are very round, and they have a narrow-shaped body. So if you see a frog and you're not sure if it's a frog or a toad, usually look for the super long legs and the moist skin and the eyes bulging out. That's one of the easiest ways to tell. Now toads, on the other hand, look a little bit different than frogs. Toads, like this cane toad in the picture, which is the largest toad species in the world, they are native to Central and South America. They're not quite as big as the Goliath frog. They get up to 9 inches long and up to 4 pounds. So even still, pretty big, pretty respectable amphibian. But toads, where frogs have long legs, toads have short walking legs. They're not going to be jumping long distances like a frog. They're going to be doing kind of a weird looking walk. Now toads also have drier, bumpier skin compared to the smooth skin of frogs. They don't have any teeth, and their eyes are lower. They don't bulge out like a frog does, and they're more oval shaped, and they have kind of a wider, chunkier body. So again, if it's kind of short, stumpy, it is likely a toad. If it's long and slender, it is likely a frog. But both frogs and toads belong to the animal group amphibians. So do our salamanders. So A few classes ago, we met Hulk, the barred tiger salamander, who is our state amphibian. All salamanders and newts belong to the grouping of amphibians as well, and there are over 700 species of salamanders and newts in the world. So newts, like this emperor newt, are just a type of salamander, but these both belong to the amphibian group. Now, the final animal that is a type of amphibian is a weird one. Oh,
So we don't have any sound.
we don't have any sound. Bizarre.
Is that better?
We are experiencing
Sorry.
technological difficulties, so we're going to try this again. Can you hear me? Please let us know if you can hear us. No? What a bizarre thing. Megan is troubleshooting, so please stay on the line while we are trying to figure out if you can hear me.
Okay,
They can hear
you,
us?
yeah.
Could they hear any of the stuff before?
It sounds like they could. They were responding, so.
Okay, so it was
Okay.
just a quick moment. Should I start again? Where did the sound cut off?
When you started talking about the barn salamander.
The salamanders. Okay, so just to refresh, for those of you that maybe had a sound shortage, technology is great until it doesn't work, right? So we talked about what it means, the groupings of amphibians. So the animals that belong to the amphibian group are frogs and toads. And we talked about the difference. Frogs have long, slender, smooth bodies, whereas toads have big, stubbier, kind of wartier bodies, bumpier bodies. And besides frogs and toads, we also have salamanders in the animal group of amphibians. So the Kansas state amphibian is the barred tiger salamander. So between salamanders and newts, which are a type of salamander, there are over 700 species of salamanders and newts in the animal group of amphibians. Now, aside from frogs and toads, salamanders and newts, most people can generally get those are amphibians. There's one weird grouping of amphibians, kind of like with reptiles. We talked about the tuatara, right? That weird lizard-like animal that lives in Australia or in New Zealand. There's a weird grouping of reptile, and there's a weird grouping of amphibians. They are what we call the caecilians. So this looks like a worm or like a snake, but it is neither. This is a type of amphibian. Caecilians they live in warm regions in South America, Africa, and Asia, and they generally live underground or even in the water. And these are a type of amphibian, and we'll go over why in just a second. It has to do with their bone structure and their skin. There are over 200 species of these worm-like amphibians in the world. But we know they are not a worm because they have a backbone. Worms don't have a backbone, whereas all amphibians do. So the 5 groupings of amphibians are toads, frogs, salamanders, newts, and caecilians. All of those are our amphibians. So let's talk about that backbone, what it means to be an amphibian. The first structure of amphibians is that all of them have an endoskeleton, which means their bones are on the inside of their body. So what I have, this is the skeleton of a frog, and you guys can see that it's got a head, which is attached to a long backbone, which is attached to its legs and its arms. So the word that we call animals with a backbone are vertebrates. And every animal group that we have talked about so far, the mammals, the birds, the reptiles, and amphibians, all of them have a backbone. Now, the last grouping of vertebrate animals are fish. And unfortunately, we're not going to talk about fish in these classes because we don't have any fish in our collection that would be worth talking about. But all 5 of those animal groupings are vertebrates. They have a backbone. So reptiles and amphibians both have a backbone. And that is one reason that we know that caecilians are amphibians, is because they have a backbone. Now also, the skin structure of amphibians is very interesting, and this is one way to tell it is an amphibian and not a reptile. Reptiles have scales on their body. Amphibians have something called semi-permeable skin, which is a really fancy way of saying they actually are able to breathe through their skin. So if you think about it at home, you have a window and you have a window screen. And on nice days, you open the window with the window screen in place and the air is able to move in and out of your house. But that window screen stops all of the bad things like the bugs from coming in. Amphibian skin is very similar to a window screen. They have holes all over their body that they are able to breathe through. The oxygen can go in and out of their skin. So when they are underwater, they don't have to hold their breath. They can actually breathe through the holes in their skin. So they can stay underwater as long as they want. But amphibians have to stay wet because if they dry out, they can actually die. So they have a layer of slime all over their body that is like a Band-Aid. It keeps all of the good things in, like the moisture, and all of the bad things out, like any bacteria or germs that are around. Which is why it is very important to always make sure your hands are wet when you hold an amphibian. Any frog, toad, salamander, make sure your hands are wet because with dry hands, you can break through the layer of slime that covers their body and they can breathe in the germs that are on your hands. So, if it has wet skin, it is an amphibian. They do not have scales. Reptiles have scales. Amphibians have semi-permeable skin, which is just a fancy way of saying it is wet and they can breathe through it. And our friends at the Kansas Children's Discovery Center, after today's class, head over to their Facebook page because they are actually doing a craft, a super cool one, revolving around amphibian skin. So after this class, head on over to their Facebook to do a craft. So, all amphibians have semi-permeable skin. All amphibians are vertebrates. They have a backbone. Now, the next classification of being an amphibian is that they are cold-blooded. Just like our reptiles, amphibians, they have to get their heat from the sun or the earth, the water around them, or a heating lamp. They do not produce their own body heat like mammals and birds do. So both reptiles, amphibians, and fish are cold-blooded. They have to get their heat from outside sources. And because of that, just like our reptiles, amphibians have 3-chambered hearts. So mammals and birds have 4 chambers. Reptiles and amphibians both have 3-chambered because they don't use as much energy having to produce their own body heat like the warm-blooded animal groups do. So both reptiles and amphibians are cold-blooded and they have the 3-chambered hearts. So let's talk a little bit about amphibian life cycles. Most amphibians in the world lay eggs. In fact, the majority of them lay eggs. And they can lay a lot of eggs. Some frog species can lay tens of thousands of eggs at a time. Now, interestingly, between frogs and toads, you can oftentimes tell the difference if you find an egg grouping. Frogs generally lay their eggs in clusters like this, where they float on the top of the water or near it, whereas toads actually lay their eggs in long strands. And the reason that is because these strands hook onto the plants in the water, and so that keeps them safe and hidden in the plants there. So toad eggs are in long strands, frog eggs are in clusters, and salamander eggs are generally small clusters or one at a time. So most amphibians lay eggs, just like most reptiles lay eggs. Although some amphibians, just a very small handful, actually give live birth. And some reptiles give live birth as well. But all amphibians go through metamorphosis, which is a fancy word for saying a life cycle at some point in their life. And so what metamorphosis is it's where they change the way they look from the time they are born until the time they become an adult. So with frogs, most people know about frog life cycles, right? They lay eggs, and then those eggs hatch out and become a tadpole. and this is a toy, but you guys can see when they are in the tadpole stage, they do not have any arms or legs. They only have a tail and a body. And at this stage, they actually breathe through gills, like a fish. However, as they grow their back legs first. So frogs, they grow their back legs first, whereas salamanders, they actually grow their front legs first, which is pretty interesting. And then they continue to grow their other sets of legs. And at this point, they are losing their gills, and they're starting to be able to develop lungs. So amphibians, when they are an adult, or close to an adult, like this one, they breathe through lungs when they are on land, and they can also breathe through their skin. But as a juvenile, as soon as they hatch out in the tadpole form, they have to breathe through gills. So amphibians actually have 3 differing ways of breathing throughout their lifetime. Gills when they are younger, and then they have lungs when they are adults, and they can breathe through their skin as well as an adult. So this is their life cycle, this metamorphosis, changing the way they look. They actually grow their body parts. It can take up to 2 years for some differing amphibian species. Now salamander metamorphosis looks very similar as well. They have eggs, then they become their larvae, and they have gills, and then they grow their front legs, then their back legs, and then they become an adult salamander. Now, interestingly, not all amphibians complete metamorphosis. There is a type of salamander called the axolotl, which actually stays in its juvenile stage. It keeps the characteristics. So it grows its legs, but it keeps part of the gills, which is pretty fascinating. These guys live down in Mexico. Even the frogs and the salamanders who give live birth, when they give live birth, the young actually go through metamorphosis inside of the mom, and they come out having been developed. So frogs, toads, salamanders, they go through a life cycle change. Most of them lay eggs, although some give live birth. Now, one final thing I want to talk about with amphibians. So a lot of people, the hardest thing when they're trying to identify if it's a reptile or an amphibian has to do with lizards and salamanders, because they do look pretty similar. So this here is a newt. Newts are types of salamanders. This is the emperor newt. Now we can tell this is an amphibian because of its smooth, wet skin. Okay, that's one of the easiest ways to tell. It's got to stay wet. This is an amphibian. Lizards, like small geckos on the other hand, they have scales. They do not have to stay wet. So this gecko is a reptile. The body covering is scales, whereas amphibians, like this newt, their body covering is smooth, wet skin. So when you're trying to identify some of the ones out in the animal kingdom, think about the skin structure. Okay, so what I want to do next is we actually have a live amphibian for us to meet. His name is Waldo, and he's on the top of his container. So Megan, if you want to shoot right there, you can actually see him. So this is a Vietnamese Mossy Frog, and they live over in Vietnam in the caves and the forests over there. Now, as you can see, I'll flip this around, Waldo is actually able to climb. They have very sticky toes that allow them to hook onto the walls of caves or to the bottom of trees, and even their containers here at the zoo. So I am going to get him out, and you guys can get a better look at him, but I think that's a really fun view to see just how well they can climb using their sticky toes. So I did wet my hands before I picked him up. Remember, it is very important that we always wet our hands before we pick up amphibians. So I am going to actually put my fingers between his legs here, because amphibians, like frogs, they can jump really, really well, and I don't want him jumping out of my hand. So if you notice, this is a very interesting looking amphibian. This is what we call a mossy frog, and you can assume, based on his coloring and his name, that he is meant to look like moss. They are one of the best examples of camouflage in the animal kingdom. When they are threatened in the wild, especially when they are in the water or on the trees over there in Vietnam where they live, they will simply clump up their body and float on the top of the water or not move on a tree,
and predators do not see them. They blend in perfectly with the moss and algae in the water, as well as on the trees. So by having this beautiful, bumpy, warty skin and this dark green color, it allows them exceptional camouflage. Here's another picture of a mossy frog. So you guys can kind of see they do vary in color slightly. They can be a little bit lighter green and darker green as well. Now, amphibians, most amphibians are going to be carnivores, so they love eating other animals. And frogs in particular are what we call opportunistic feeders, which means they'll eat anything they can fit in their mouth. Mossy frogs generally eat bugs, differing types of insects. Here at the zoo, they get crickets. They could eat some amphibian eggs, like if there's other frog eggs around, or maybe even small fish, but most of the time they are going to be eating insects. Now, although he is tiny, this is a full-grown frog. We know that he is not a baby because, remember, they go through a life cycle. They go through metamorphosis. So if he was younger, he would be in his tadpole stage or his froglet stage, where they are still growing their legs. But they are only about 2.5 to 3.5 inches long, so they are a small frog species. Unfortunately, they are very common in the illegal pet trade, both legally and illegally. People steal them out of the wild and keep them as pets or sell them as pets because they are such an interesting species. So, before we take questions, I just want to give you guys the worksheet, and then we will go over some of your questions at home. So I have right here, it's a comparison and contrast chart between reptiles, amphibians, and both. Because through my work at the Topeka Zoo, I can tell you that these two animal groups are the ones that people confuse the most. So at the bottom is a word bank, and you need to put in whether the word, like vertebrates, is it just reptiles, is it just amphibians, or is it both? So you guys can kind of sort out at home some of these structures that make them reptile amphibians or ones they have in common. As always, take a picture and put it in the comments. So I know I just threw a lot at you guys regarding amphibians. They are a really interesting grouping of animals. Unfortunately, they are also declining at a super rapid rate. 41% of all amphibians in the world are threatened with extinction because of habitat loss, pollution, and then poaching as well, or taking them for the pet trade. So we want to respect our amphibians. Please leave them alone if you see them in the wild, and if you do pick them up, make sure your hands are wet. Do not ever put them in tap water. Okay, you need to actually have aged water that has sat out for several days, or at a pet store you can buy tablets that make your tap water safe. But tap water has too many things in it that it does not work for the amphibians. It would harm them. So please learn about them before you handle them, because they are a pretty sensitive animal. Okay, do we have any questions?
Do sharks and manta rays have backbones?
Yes, so they are types of fish, and so they have a backbone. So backbones, remember we talked about this with the mammals, I believe. Backbones allow animals to get really, really big. So the invertebrates, which we'll talk about next week with 4th grade, they do not have they don't have backbones. That's why you don't see bugs the size of elephants, right? The backbone is what allows things to get super big. So fish sharks are a type of fish.
How did we get Waldo?
So Waldo, who gets his name, by the way, from the children's I Spy game, Where's Waldo? Him and his brother got transferred from another zoo. And these guys in the wild live 10, 12, 15 years, but in human care they can live a little bit longer. So we have had them for several years now, and they came in as adults, but hopefully we have them for several years more. They're really interesting little frogs. And it's fun to even try and find them in their enclosure here at the zoo, because even in the greenery that we have for them here, they're hard to find sometimes.
Where can we find them at the zoo?
They are here in the Gary Clark Education Room. So they are at the front of the room to the right as you walk in. And we have two. We have Waldo and we have Carmen, named after Carmen Sandiego, which was another popular children's game back when I was younger.
Did we name them, or did the zoo before us name them?
We named them. Yep. We like to give them weird, silly names like that. But I mean, think about this. If you were a predator in Vietnam and China where they live, you would hardly be able to see these guys. They are so good at camouflage. Even humans have a hard time finding them to study them oftentimes.
Why does the salamander have stripes like a tiger?
Oh, great question. So bar tiger salamanders, they are nocturnal, which means they're out at nighttime. Mossy frogs are also nocturnal. So the black coloring allows them to blend in with the night, and the yellow color is actually a warning color because this type of salamander is poisonous. So bright colors in the animal kingdom oftentimes are warning predators. Don't mess with me, I am poisonous, or there are other things about my body that you would not enjoy. So the black is camouflage and the yellow is a warning that they are poisonous. But it's just a little bit, and it comes out of the base of their tail. It's not their whole body, and they can choose to secrete it or not. So it's not like a poison dart frog where their whole body is caked in poison. These guys, it's a little bit less specific. One other fun fact about mossy frogs that I want to get in is mossy frogs, they do make like a chirping, like a frog croaking sound, and they can actually make it so that it sounds like it could be up to 10 feet. Defense is not going to be to swim away or to jump away. It's going to be to cluster up and to not move. Okay. Well, again, please go and visit the Kansas Children's Discovery Center Facebook page. They have a craft on amphibian skin. Do our worksheet comparing it, put it in the comments, and we will be back tomorrow for our final lesson this week at 10 a.m. We have a very cute family that we are going to meet over in the rainforest. So we'll see you guys tomorrow for 5th grade curriculum. Bye!